You're listening to DruidCast episode 160.
Try to paint a picture with your eyes wide open.
Do you draw what you dream sometimes? Is it hard to draw what you see in your head?
sidewalk, with the chalk on the sidewalk. Even while drawing that very first line, she laid out the treasures of her beautiful mind with the chalk on the sidewalk. In the chalk on the sidewalk, flying fish in a coastal cove, a map to the pirate's treasure trove. In the chalk on the sidewalk, with the chalk on the sidewalk. Always encourage the mind of a child. Imagination is meant to run wild with the chalk on the sidewalk. With the chalk on the sidewalk, everybody sing. Try to paint a picture with your eyes wide open. Let's keep the magic on our side. Try to paint a picture with your eyes wide open. Let's make it safe to play outside. I see my friends and neighbors in the whole design, not templates for a police outline. In the chalk on the sidewalk, in the chalk on the sidewalk. See, I believe in their rights to stand up, to be heard and answered, to not end up in the chalk on the sidewalk. Just a body in the chalk on the sidewalk. Can't breathe in the chalk on the sidewalk. Down in Houston with a clock on the sidewalk. Come on. Love thy neighbor still applies, regardless of creed. Compassion must rise, or else what will we be in our children's eyes but the very same monsters we claim to despise? Little kids ain't throwing shade when they show us the truth in the art that they made with the chalk on the sidewalk. With the chalk on the sidewalk. Tina's just a little girl, but give her some room and she can change the world with the chalk on the sidewalk. It all starts with the chalk on the sidewalk. Everybody sing. Try to paint a picture with your eyes wide open. Let's keep the magic on our side. Try to paint a picture with your eyes wide open. Let's make it safe to play outside. Try to paint a picture with your eyes wide open. Let's keep compassion on our side. Oh, try to paint a picture with your eyes wide open. Let's make it safe to play outside for them.
Hello my friends and welcome to DruidCast episode 160. I am your host Dave the Bard, and DruidCast is brought to you on or around the 20th of every month by the order of Bards, Ovates and Druids. If you want to find out more about our courses, you can do that on our website, which is at www.druidry.org. Opening the show, you heard Bonnie at Morn, a new recording by folk band and good friends of mine, Mad Maudlin. I love the retro Steel Eye Span guitar work on that, and if you go to Mad Maudlin's website, you'll also find a great video for the song that the band put together during lockdown. After that, you heard a new single from another bardic buddy of mine, S.J. Tucker, called Chalk on the Sidewalk, and we will have another song from the lovely Suge later in the show. Now, normally I would have been out and about at events around the country listening to inspiring speakers and getting their permission to place their talks on DruidCast. But with every conference and camp being cancelled this year, this has not happened. So in about 2 months' time, I will be on Skype doing some interviews with teachers, writers, musicians, leaders, and getting deep into their spiritual path. But I do have at least 2 more talks in the pipeline for you. The talky bit this month is a talk given by Jonathan Argento at this year's and Derrida Fest, one of only a couple of conferences in the UK that managed to go ahead back in February. Jonathan is a witch, teacher and public speaker whose practice draws upon the foundation of both modern and traditional witchcraft, blended with the wisdom of mystical traditions and philosophical ideas from across the globe. He holds a BA, PGCE and MA in Religious Studies, and has taught religion and philosophy in secondary schools and at sixth form in West Sussex. It's a fascinating talk and it does not shy away from some difficult topics, and the talk is called Chords and Coastal Magic. I'll see you after.
The Talky Bit.
I'm looking forward to this one. So, give a huge and very illustrious welcome to Jonathan Martin.
Whoa, thank you very much. Blimey. If I walk over here, I still can't see anyone other than the front row, so I'm just going to look at the front row. Guys, what I'm going to do today is kind of a bit of a narrative. It's a bit of an observation, and maybe it'll inspire you to do some stuff too. To set the story up, when I was about 11, maybe 10, my parents, who were living in Fareham, moved to Hertfordshire. I didn't. They sent me to a boarding school in Fareham, which I wasn't best pleased at. But it meant that when I went home in the school holidays, my holidays were twice as long as everyone else's, and I didn't know any other kids. So what I would do is I'd wander around the woods. And I absolutely loved the October half term. It's my favourite time of year. And I'd wander around the woods and I'd start experiencing different things, which was kind of a bit weird for an 11-year-old boy. And it didn't take me long to realise that the woods were as live as anything I'd ever been to. And that there were different areas where I felt comfortable and areas where I felt uncomfortable, and places that seemed pleased for me to be there, and so forth. And I began to realise that I was a witch. Quite unusual in the early 70s for a young boy. I kind of got more and more interested. I discovered that I became quite adept in borrowing books from bookstores. There weren't that many books on the subject at the time. I should tell you the name of the village my parents moved to. It was Bricket Wood, which I'm sure some of you will have heard of. When I was there, I think it sported 3 nudist colonies and 3 covens, and it was a village of about 3,000 people. And so that kind of kicked my journey off. And then I discovered The Sorcerer's Apprentice, which would send me books in brown paper packaging so that no one at school knew what I was getting. So by the time I was about 14, 15, I'd read quite a lot of Crowley. Yeah, I know. Canal. And the conclusion I drew on Crowley is I understood about half what he'd written. The trouble was I couldn't work out which bloody half it was. And then about a year later, something extraordinary happened. So in the space of a couple of years, I'd realised I was a witch, and then punk rock happened. Yeah, absolutely. And this was phenomenal. And so those 2 things, knowing that I'm a witch and the raw DIY energy of punk rock, have kind of stuck with me. I can hear them jingling in the background. Guys, when they're brilliant, it's so nice to stand on a stage that has good energy rather than walk out into this dead space. Anyway, my story now travels forward to 1999. I wonder if you can remember the first ever group ritual you went to. Because I can, for a very, very good reason. It was the spring equinox, 1999, and having done rituals by myself, I wanted to go and see what a group ritual looked like. So there was a ritual advertised at Chanctonbury Ring. Ooh. So I very bravely asked a friend if they'd come with me. And we packed up our stuff and we drove in my car to Chanctonbury Ring, and we stopped at the car park, which is where we were supposed to be meeting. And when we got there was no one there. Now, you know, I wasn't really aware of pagan time then, but, you know, we waited 40 minutes. And there was, yeah, I was being optimistic. And there was no one there except for this one car parked in the corner. And the engine was running, but no one got out. And, you know, they might have been doing anything. We didn't really know. So we just stayed. And then after about 45 minutes, we thought, oh, sod it. We'll climb up to the ring ourselves and have our own ritual. So we did. And we climbed up to the top, and it took about 40 minutes or so. And when we got to the top of the hill, that beautiful, beautiful space, we could see that on another hilltop, there was a ritual going on. And you could make out the fire, and we could see people dancing, and we could hear a bit of drumming. And so it was all rather frustrating, but we thought, we won't let the opportunity go to waste. We'll do our own ritual. So we did, and my friend had brought a didge, and we had quite a nice time up there. And then we made our way back down the hill, somewhat disappointed. You know, that was supposed to be my first open ritual. And when we got down to the car park, I felt very uncomfortable. And we noticed that the one car that parked in the corner was still there with its engine running. So we walked over to see what was going on. I saw the hose pipe long before my friend did. True story, guys. And so we got there, and this poor man had taken his life. And I can't imagine what was going through his mind at the time. And I don't know how long he'd been there, other than he was there when we arrived. The second problem we had is, if you've ever been to Changebury, there's not a lot of houses around there. And as we were going to a ritual, we hadn't taken any mobile phones. It's gone midnight. So there we are, wandering around, trying to find a house to knock on the door. And eventually we do. And we phone the police, and the police come out, and the police want to know what two men are doing up on Changebury Ring together. Hey, we were at public school together, you know? And I didn't give him a Masonic handshake. I thought that might be pushing out a plot. I don't know one, so... Yeah. And it was all a bit of a weird experience. And so we were naturally quite deflated. And on our way back to Chichester, we stopped off by the sea, and we waited for the tide to turn, and then we put all our negativity and our sadness and sense of loss into the sea. And it suddenly made perfect sense. So my talk is on chords and coastal magic. It didn't put me off. I eventually found a wonderful lady who some of you here will have known and met, Maureen Wheeler. And I joined her coven. She was a remarkable woman. One of her favourite sayings was, if it's not fun, it shouldn't be done. I soon realised that meant if it's not fun for her to observe you stitching it up, you can. So she was forever backfooting us. She was a wonderful teacher, and I love her greatly and miss her very much. And I learnt about chords. And obviously I took my chords. I was duly bound and beaten and generally done to in my initiation. But I learned that you could do things with chords other than just hang your athame on them. So some of the things that you'll be aware of are the witch's wheel. Anyone done a witch's wheel? I won't be able to see your hands if they go up. Basically, it's where you link chords and you work energy round and round, and providing you have the right level of tension, it all works. If it doesn't, it just looks like a bizarre game of Twister. Which is kind of quite nice if you've got some nice female witches to land on, but I didn't, so. And you also learn not to do that around a fire. That's kind of quite dangerous. I also learned the spell of the chord. Now, I'm sure you'll come across this. It's where you take a chord and you put 9 knots in it. Each knot has its own chant, and each chant has its own intent. And there are loads and loads of variations. It's a very simple piece of magic, but it's really worth doing. So I'm going to cite one here from Vicky Bramshaw, a good friend of mine, in her book, The Craft of the Wise. And basically she's describing the action. So I tie this cord strong and true, 1, 2, so 2 knots. Knots 1 to 9 to see it through, 3, 4 knots. And by my will this spell create 5, 6 knots. I tie these knots to seal this fate, 7, 8. And by this knot the thing is mine, 9. Now, I don't know about you, I'm not really good at chants. I struggled a bit with the Druid's prayer, just about do that. I'm not a Druid, so I don't say it very often. But for me, magic is all about simplicity, and not magic needs to be. Muttering and blowing on knots is a particularly interesting form of magic. I discovered that it's banned in Islamic cultures for its magical connotations. And then in certain periods of history, the tying of knots in public was banned too, for its magical significance. Of course, there are lots of positive aspects to chord magic and knot magic. Sometimes 3 chords can be plaited together and woven with feathers. There's an example of this in the Pitt Rivers Museum. And people aren't really too sure whether it's a death spell or whether or not it's a hunting spell to prevent the stag deer from running away from you. I'm with the stag deer on that one myself. You can put hagstones into a cord for protection or to avert illness and for spirit travel. You can use bent pins or iron nails to break a curse or bad fortune. Blackthorn spikes and a key to protect a home or a locked possession. So basically it's entirely up to you. And my take on magic is always that magic is primarily an artisan act. If magic is the art and science of changing consciousness at will, then it is an artisan act. What makes magic work for us is what we put into it, the uniqueness, the unique quality of our own experience and our own intention that we put into it. My next project that I'm working on, which should be ready for May, is an anti-fascist rosary. I can remember, sadly, throwing rocks at the National Front in the late 70s with the Anti-Nazi League. I was quite disappointed recently when all we could manage to do was throw milkshakes at fascists. But, you know, times change. And if all this is a bit heavy for you, you know, and I appreciate it's a family show and people are coming from all different perspectives, one of the other things I've found works really well with not magic is in mindfulness. In mindfulness where you have to find a way of clearing a busy, over-fertile imagination just to give yourself a break and some peace. What you can do is you can use a chord of 9 and just sit, and as you meditate, every time a random thought pops into your head, tie a knot. And it moves it away. And by the time you've done that about 9 times, you're pretty well sorted. So you can use that as a grounding exercise too. But a lot of chord magic is actually in binding. You can make a binding spell with a stinging nettle. Has anyone made one before? Can't see anything here. Basically what you do is you take a strip of stinging nettle and you very, very carefully strip the leaves off. And then you split it down the middle, again, very, very carefully. And you'll find that there's a kind of woody pith in the middle that you extract. And then the kind of outer skin you can split into strips. And then you just want to let them dry for a little while, an hour or so, maybe 2 hours. And then you can bind them to make a cord. Now, I like this example because it's a good reminder to us that you can't work magic without some of it rubbing off on you. Okay, so if you try, and that traditionally, certainly in some parts of Europe, this is used for binding a lover to you. Now, if you kind of do that kind of magic, sooner or later you really are going to get stung. So personally, I'm not in favour of love magic unless it's very bland and open, but certainly not if it's manipulating someone else to fall in love with you. Because you should never really work magic you're not prepared to have worked on yourself. And I think that's a far better ethic. But my favourite binding spell is a 4,000-year-old Babylonian binding spell. Okay? And this involves taking a poppet and binding it. And the binding goes like this. By the command of Marduk, or Martuk, the lord of dreams, the master of bewitchment, both male and female, with ropes I will entwine, as in a cage I will catch, as with cords I will tie, as in a net I will overpower, as in a sling I will twist as a fabric. I will tear. With dirty water from a well I will fill. As a wall I will throw them down. And so it's nice, this one, because you kind of get all the actions. I like an active magic. So we tried that one out with one of my groups the other week. So we'll see how that one plays out. Okay? But you don't need to worry. So cords and knots have been used throughout history as outlined as mala beads in the Vedic tradition, rosaries in liturgical Christianity, misbah beads, which are the 99 names of Allah. In Judaism, the talit or prayer shawl carries fringes comprising of 8 threads and 5 knots, totaling 613, which is the number of commandments in the Torah. So basically what I'm really saying here is that people have always tied knots in cords or tied knots and put beads on them. It's just one of those things that people do. Cords, by their very function, define our experience, from birth to hand fasting, to the birth of our own children, if we have them, to the groups or people we belong to, and ultimately to our own death. Ultimately, we are all linked together through the cords that bind us in the interconnectedness of all things, or the web of the weird. So as we know, not only is everything in the universe connected, but it's also in motion and subject to change. And because everything is in motion and subject to change, what we get is resonance, correspondence, and a synchronization. And this level of spontaneous self-organization creates a flexible order in the universe. Everything manages and influences everything else. So we're all constantly kind of acting, reacting, and basically making up our own fun as we go along. And this kind of works. It explains how, against all the odds, there's life in a universe that somehow holds together. And of course, it's also the reason in which magic works. If there was no change, we could have no magic. So that's where I was kind of up to. And then a bolt from the blue came out and rather messed up my magic, which is great, thanks. In 2014, I went to hear a man called Peter Gray speak at a conference in Reading. Anyone heard of Peter Gray? Okay. And this is what he said. So his opening gambit. How tame we have become, how polite about our witchcraft. In our desire to harm none, we've become harmless. We bargain to get a seat at the table of the great face, to whom we remain an anathema. How much compromise have we made in our private practice for the mighty freedom of being able to wear a pewter pentagram at work or at school? Late capitalist culture does not care what our fantasy dress-up life is like, as long as we work our zero-hour contracts, carry our mobile phones, and just keep consuming. The reason that social services are not taking your children away is that no one really believes in the existence of the witch. We have mistaken social and economic change for the result of our own advocacy. I will not be part of this process. because to do so is to be complicit with the very forces that are destroying all life on Earth. It's time for witchcraft not to choose, but to remember which side it's on in this struggle. So there you have me, really. I'm going, oh, that's great, fantastic. And like most experiences, the worst was yet to come. So whilst I agreed with everything he said then, he then went on to outline, remember this is 2014, so 6 years ago. We are living in a mass extinction event. This is not a theory. Over 70% of all insects face imminent destruction. Over half the species on Earth will be extinct by 2050. The Earth itself is fragile, exhausted. It takes 100 years to produce a centimetre of topsoil. Earth, we bid you hail and welcome. 80%, or nearly 80%, of all sea pollution is plastic. Not the result of drinking straws, but industrial fishing. Oceans overfished so that they resemble deserts. Ocean acidification is inevitable. Natural water poisoned by fracking, industrial slurry, intensive farming, or, my addition here, bought up by multinationals bargaining chips in future wars. Water, we bid you hail and welcome. The outlook for fire and air is even more worrying. Their imbalance, combined with nuclear reactor meltdowns, threatens to purge the planet of all life for 100 million years. Mainstream scientists minimise the message. Science selects for conservatism. Academia selects for extreme conservatism. Both are dependent on funding for the very companies who've caused this apocalypse. Fire and air, we bid you hail and welcome. And by then, I was thoroughly depressed. The wheel of the year was wobbling. The elements seemed set to consume all life. And 6 years ago, I really wished he was wrong. I thought he was wrong. I thought he was over-exaggerating, and I found it such a negative message. Because what I really wanted to do was carry on with the old religion to a familiar paganism where business was usual. And yet I was utterly haunted by what he said. And you can find a transcript of his talk. You just search Peter Gray, Apocalyptic Witchcraft, or Peter Gray, Reading Pagan Federation Conference. You can find it online. And then something else happened that profoundly affected me. 7 months after that, my mentor, Maureen, passed to the Summerlands. And yeah, another cord had been snapped. So it was kind of a fairly traumatic time for me. I'm trying to work out how it all fits together. And then 2 years ago, I embarked on a magical project. I wanted to birth an entity, the Leveller, to speak truthfully about environmental collapse and to call out politicians and the media for misleading people. So just a small project then. The Leveller started as a sigil. So we know that a sigil can be a sign, a symbol, or a squiggle that contains a great deal of information that's inherent in its construction. And the idea was that the sigil would gradually grow and develop into a free-ranging servitor and then ultimately an entity in its own right. Now, if you're going to embark on a project like that, you're going to have to create a great deal of energy over a sustained period of time and protect what you're doing as it grows like a child. So, the sigil itself was created very simply by taking out the vowels and repeat letters from the word leveller, which gives you LVR. And as I played with these, a shape emerged that looked a bit like a wonky bridge. So I previously worked magic based upon structures of buildings. And, this building has its own structure and it complies with certain standards and requirements, keeps it stable. And if you want, you can bury magic in buildings and use the structure of the building to hold the magic in place. It's kind of quite fun and useful. It's good for putting secrets that people don't need to find about into. Not that I have any of those, obviously. But a bridge seemed to be a much better way of doing it. After all, a bridge is a metaphor for crossing boundaries, for travel, and for just for a process, a journey. As you know, many folk traditions have trolls living under bridges, and the trolls demand a payment in order to cross the bridge. A bridge, by definition, facilitates movement, either over it or under it. And this movement can create fairly continuous energy. And so the idea of the troll was that troll would act as both a receptor and a childminder as the sigil grew to full strength. So, I kind of outlined this conference a couple of years ago, and what we did is we went round and we chalked the sigil on columns of bridges right the way along the south coast. And if it was a bridge, it was fair game. It could be a little track in the New Forest that only ponies used. Or it could be like a main motorway bridge. And so all bridges were fair game. We even superimposed one on Westminster Bridge. Tidal bridges seemed particularly powerful. I'll never forget clambering down to the bridge that links Hayling Island to the mainland, and trying to get close to the column with me chalk in my hand because I didn't want to graffiti anything. I wanted it to be nice and healthy, and slipping. And I'm there like hanging on for dear life as the water's rushing underneath me, thinking this is really, really powerful. I'm not doing this again. And people said, Jonathan, what will this look like when it's done? How will we know that the magic's worked? And of course, magic never ever exists in isolation. That's the beauty of magic. So we can be involved in little projects that seem kind of tiny and insignificant. In Sweden, an unknown teenager began a personal protest by boycotting school. In the UK, a fledgling movement emerged around an eyeglass sigil. So it kind of worked. It was just before and around the time that was happening that we were doing this. And I know lots and lots of people were working magic, and I'm not for one moment suggesting we were solely responsible at all, but I'm saying it actually did work. And for us, we had an answer to magic. So, this, of course, is just the beginning. Just because we're having Extinction Rebellion and Greta on the scene doesn't mean it's all going to go away. And it struck me that the biggest problem we had in trying to deal with this is this ridiculous pyramid scheme called capitalism. And that absolutely everything we do is embedded in capitalism. And that the oil and fuel and petrochemicals and plastics are all part of this horrendous monster that's consuming us alive. George Monbiot, who I'm a big fan of, has said we cannot have both capitalism and the environment. We have to compromise on one or the other. And so it appears that we're stuck in a gridlock, a kind of Gordian knot. See, that's my reference back in now to not magic. So in mythology, we have this wonderful story of Gordias, an unassuming farmer who drove an ox cart into an Anatolian city. He fulfilled an ancient prophecy and was declared king. Wow. Now, if you think that's odd, don't get lost on the storyline. It does seem a strange way to elect a leader. That is until last November, when Britain elected a leader who hid in a fricking fridge and appeared as a block of ice in a climate change debate. Alexander Boris de Peffer Johnson, I salute you. Anyway, back to the story. Midas, the farmer's son, was so pleased that he dedicated the ox cart that his dad rode in and constantly became king to Zeus, or probably Sabios or Dionysus. I'm going for the latter two there, and tied it with a magical knot to an oak post. Legend had it that the person who untied the Gordian knot would become a great ruler in Asia. So we then fast forward to 333 BCE, which is kind of easy to remember. It's got 3 threes in it. Enter Alexander, later to become the Great, who attempts to untie the knot, but he couldn't do it. In the end, he realised actually that this was a bit of a strange conundrum, and all he had to do was get his sword out and chop the knot off, and then it was released. So there's 2 versions of this story, one where he uses a sword, and the other where he removes the linchpin from the yoke. So he literally pulls out the pin, they separate, he can get to the ends of the knot and untie it. And I do believe that there are linchpins that need removing. Rather that than using the sword. So maybe we'll come on to that in a bit. So, you've probably gathered here that I'm kind of quite proactive in terms of my magic. And one of the problems we have with magic is that people are wary of using magic they perceive to be negative or in some way harmful. And I understand this, and it is complicated, and there are lots of different versions of the law of threefold law of return, which I have got time to go into now. But basically, people are afraid of taking negative action in case it rebounds back on them. It's kind of like a bizarre form of karma. So, Martin Luther King, shortly before he was assassinated, said capitalism was built on the exploitation of black slaves, and it continues to thrive on the exploitation of the poor, both black and white, both here and abroad. So, if we think this one through, if people are worried about karmic consequences, which essentially is a Vedic idea, it's not really a pagan idea on one level anyway, then we need to think a bit more about karma. And of course, karma isn't how most people understand it. It's a far more complicated thing than that. So let's take a longer range view of karma and put karma to the test. Okay. So in following Martin Luther King's cue here, in 1833, Britain outlawed a form of slavery. And they did that and paid reparations. They paid, I just need to get the right figure here. They paid off 40%. So they used 40% of the Britain's national budget, and it was awarded to slave owners in compensation. So not to the slaves, because obviously that would be far too simple and obvious. No, it needs to go to the people who are going to be financially out of pocket. Clearly we were operating under quite a strange scheme even in those days. Okay, so that was 1833. Do you know when that national debt was paid off? Do you have any idea when it was paid off? Yeah, 2015. That means over all that time, the slaves who've been freed, their children, their children, their children's children, and all of us have been paying that debt back. Sadly, not to the people who really should have received it. We might have paid it off a bit quicker, but in 2008 we blew 500 billion on bailing out the banks, so that might have speeded up a bit. But my point is that one of the beneficiaries of that repayment was a family called Cameron. Yep. The same David Cameron who introduced austerity. So just someone help me out here. How does that work with karma? Yeah? Really? You sure? So my money is on not worrying too much about the backdraft. If we work magic, if stuff needs to be sorted, we need to sort it. It's worth the challenge. So I love living on the south coast. Most of my magic has been spent up on the Downs or at Kingley Vale or in private groves. Private groves are great because it's private land, no one else can be there. I did actually do a ritual once on in a private grove, and as I recall, I was really only wearing some antlers. I don't actually think I was wearing a lot else. And I noticed a little red dot moving across the land. Yeah. And there were poachers on this private land. And I really didn't know what to do. Do I kind of pull off my antlers or cover my embarrassment? It is indeed a true story.
Which one did you pick?
The bits every time. Okay. So, what I want to talk about on the next bit here is how I've worked with coastal magic. You kind of go, I've done the core bit, and there's lots of stuff we can do with that. I've done the whole activism thing, and actually what I do feel we as a people group need to be giving our time and attention to, that there are some big issues that we need to come to terms with and act accordingly. So I've spent a lot of time down on the coastline recently, where there are beautiful, as you know if you live around here, there's wonderful seashore groves, there's secluded coves, and you get this wonderful environment where the land meets the water. And somewhere in all of that, the sky touches both. It's just beautiful. It's kind of a pragmatic place to work magic too, because we get 2 high tides and 2 low tides every 24 hours and 50 minutes, or thereabouts. That's a lot quicker than waiting for a lunar cycle. And one of my problems is, people contact me and go, Jonathan, I need some help, can you work some magic for this? It's the wrong time for the lunar phase, mate. Don't ask me that. And of course, don't need to worry about that now. I can just pop down to the beach and use the tides the same way as I would use the moon. It's real simple, and it's real easy to just download a tide chart too. So the ever-changing coastline itself provides its own inspiration. So just to give you some ideas, I've made poppets from binding seaweed. That's really cool. Really good fun. I've used stones and shells, Sharpies. Whoever invented the Sharpie, absolutely brilliant for drawing sigils on stones. Absolutely fantastic. Really good. Loads and loads of hagstones. And I don't know about you guys, but I use hagstones for scrying. There's something very extraordinary about peering through a hagstone. It's that restricted field of vision, like wearing a mask in a ritual. You kind of enter a different state. Clamshells, which are fairly plentiful and just really good because you can just pop some magic inside the clam, bind it up, and toss it into the sea. There are accounts of witches selling 3 knots in a rope. I'm sure you've heard of this, where witches would tie different amounts of wind into a cord. So the first would be a breeze, the second knot would be for a good wind, and the third would cause a gale. So lots of nice stories about that. Quick plug here for some books that I've looked at for this. There's Traditional Witchcraft for the Seashore by Melitune Draco, and Water Witchcraft by Anwin Avalon. So I'm just tagging them because if you want to learn more, that's a great place to start, and I haven't written a book on the subject. Okay, so whilst it's not strictly true that ocean waves travel in groups of 7, and the 7th wave is the biggest of the bunch, it can appear that way. So I was always taught as a kid, the seventh wave was always the biggest. But in actual fact, it isn't necessarily so. Waves are caused by the wind, tides are caused by the moon. The wind initially creates random waves which, given time, modulate in the same way that the web of the weird modulates into regular patterns, or at least observable patterns. By observing this pattern, you can use knot magic, tying a knot as each wave breaks on the shore. Obviously, the rougher the sea, the greater the energy. But do use caution here, unless you're prepared to get wet or washed away. Now, my favourite place to work coastal magic is on those narrow spits of shingle that go out into the sea. Simply because on a dark night, on a very narrow strip of land, you can walk right out into the ocean. And you do have to watch your step, and you do have to be quite careful. But the beauty of those spits of land is that they create completely different wave patterns, and that the tide coming in will rebound and crisscross. So you get this amazing kind of crisscross effect of waves, which is really, really good for slightly more chaotic magic and mischief making. You can work magic with those waves in a very unique way. And just in case you're thinking, oh, Jonathan, you're so clever. I'm not. My dog discovered it for me. She was paddling through the shallows when this wave bounced and came off from nowhere and went right over her. And she wasn't best pleased at it. So that's how I discovered that. Being honest here, so thank you, Tizzy. Last November, for the full moon, I went down to my favourite piece of coastland to work some magic. And I wrote it up in my journal, and to give you an idea of that experience, I'm going to read it to you. So I hope this works. So, full moon November. Driving through the darkness, along a peninsula once cut off by the sea, past the old ferry station, journeying along land once reclaimed, that inevitably will be returned to water. Twisting lanes narrowing, hedges reflecting dipped headlights dance like waves around me. Solitary places in the lane remind me of my own necessary seclusion. Slowing down to avoid potholes until I can park somewhere safely out of sight. Stepping out, walking carefully, quietly, opening the wooden gate, knowing that with the click of the heavy latch, my presence will not be disturbed. Emerging from the darkness is a small building, one remaining chancel, remnant of a Saxon church, one of the first in Sussex, now seldom used. Guarded by dark headstones, remnants of the loved, the lost, and the lonely. Bowing to history and mindful of magic to follow, with a wry smile I pay my respects. Beginning my slow sinstrel walk around the church, completing 7 Widdershins circuits in silent meditation. Inviting those among the dead who wish to join my journey, I move steadily onwards, opening the gate and leaving the churchyard. Turning to my left, walking softly past a long-gone castle. Its remaining mound and water-filled moat resembles a smaller Silbury hill. I smile as I remember past rituals held there. The path itself leads down to eerie mudflats, flooded and sometimes impassable at high tide. The stillness broken by owls in the distance, curlews in the wetlands, concerned at my presence, and maybe by those accompanying me. Occasionally the hint of the full moon illuminates the ghostly, liminal, watery marshlands, only to vanish behind the clouds. The sea remains unseen, tucked behind banked up shingle, I can hear it though. Hidden waves crashing, and it sends shivers down my spine. Or perhaps I'm just cold and a little afraid. Walking becomes harder now, and the climb up the shifting stones requires my full attention. Finally, in front of me lies the sea, a vast liminal portal between the realms, the tide about halfway to full, with a small patch of sand to my left. Walking to the water's edge, I make offerings and perform a simple ritual. The moon fully appears, hanging like a beacon in the night sky, illuminating miles of empty beach with moonlight flickering on glossy water. Taking a piece of folded paper, I pause and shout my petition, waiting for the right moment. When a wave slaps my legs, the cold water makes me laugh, and I hurl my spell into the water. After a few minutes, I return to the solitary strip of sand and draw a healing sigil for a friend's mother. Using driftwood and shells, I build a little altar for her recovery. Feelings of joy and gratitude arise. The moon has energized the night sky, perfectly reflecting in the water. As above, so below. The incoming tide will cover and return all things. I have done what I can, what I must. After about 15 minutes, I feel cold. And gathering everyone together, I retrace my steps along the mud flats with the sound of geese around me. Gathering all the magic in, I carefully shut the gate on the churchyard and return to my calm. Magic works not in isolation, but in virtue of its connection and timing. Magic can be an intensely personal act, but it is also a profoundly political act. It may feel at the time like a drop in the ocean, and most of the magic I do feels just like that. But it does have a habit of drawing together or shoaling with other magic, like a groundswell. So one of the analogies I use is basically I'm just encouraging people to fire lots and lots of arrows, loads and loads of arrows. I don't have a howitzer, and I don't know how we do that. And do you know what I mean? But I do think that group and individual magic will make a big change. If there is to be any real meaningful future, I'm aware that Chichester will be on this, be Chichester by the sea in 20 years if we're not careful. Not so good for Southwick, I guess. Then we need to do something. We need to gather. So for those of us here, that by necessity involves magic. And I hope that what I've said has encouraged you to use some cool magic and some coastal magic. Do get down to the sea. It is just so amazingly liberating. And just make sure you get the tide times right. The place I described, you get the tide times wrong, you can't get back that way. You have to do a 3-mile detour. Very embarrassing when you take your in-laws there and get the tide, Anyway, won't go there. So I'm going to conclude my talk with an extract from Dion Fortune's The Sea Priestess. I saw the sea gods come, moving with an irresistible momentum, not rising into the air as the riders rose, but deep in their own element, unhasting, unresting. For the power of the sea is in the weight of the waters and not in the wind-blown crests. These great ones rose with the tide, and like the tide, nothing might withstand them. So here's to linchpin removal, and here's to groundswell magic. And thank you very much for listening to me. It's been an absolute privilege. Thank you.
When shall we all meet again? Heart to heart and hand to hand. Through the dark and through the mist, Spirit joins in sacred tryst. When shall we all meet again? Heart to heart and hand to hand. Through the distance, through the danger. Strong our spirit, love is no stranger. When shall we all meet again? Heart to heart and hand to hand. Through times of illness, times of sorrow, our circle sings a new tomorrow. Apollo, Isis, Artemis, heal our bodies and spirits. Bridget, Granus, Erin, Lay, guide the healer's hands, we pray. When shall we all meet again? Heart to heart and hand to hand.
take some time to heal. This machine and I know the work continues over time. No vacation from the lies. All the old familiar rhymes do not suit our changing times. Damned if the revolution ain't televised and broadcast far and wide. Keep documenting all that's ours. Keep on speaking truth to power. Listen and lift up, survive. 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 Survive.
What a great talk. I hope you enjoyed that as much as the people who were at the conference in February did, and maybe it's left you with a few things to think about too. I think I'll try and get Jonathan on the show as one of our interviewed guests in the future. I think he would make a great guest to really chew the fat with. After the talky bit, you heard When Shall We All Meet Again by Ginger Ackley, that was written after reading one of my blog articles that pondered on when we can once more meet in our circles to share sacred space together again. And then we had the second song from S.J. Tucker called Wild Times, a song particularly fitting, I think, after hearing some of the things Jonathan spoke about in his talk. Yes, wild times indeed, my friends. And this music means we are nearing the end of the show, but before I go, let's have the results of last month's competition. The prize was a signed copy of my new double album, Up Mabinogi, the third branch. And the question I asked was, in the tale, the 7 survivors of the war include the most famous and eloquent bard of Albion. What is his name? Well, the answer was Taliesin. And the first name drawn from the hat and winner of my CD is Neil Rind from Edinburgh. Congratulations, Neil. That CD will be with you very soon. The prize this month is a fabulous book, but it's not really connected to the talk or theme of the show. But I really wanted one of you to win it, and I also wanted the rest of you to know about it. It's a book called A History of Druidry in Australia, edited by Sandra Greenhall and Elkie White, and is a collection of essays written by members of the Order and others who follow the Druid path on the Singing Land. It's a great read for anyone living there, and also a really important insight into Druidry in the Southern Hemisphere. So to win the book, here is this month's question. While the Northern Hemisphere is celebrating the summer solstice, which festival are Druids in the Southern Hemisphere celebrating? Email your answer along with your full postal address to podcast@druidry.org, and one of you will win that brilliant book. Go on, have a go. Look, somebody wins every month, right? After all, and it could easily be you. Well, my friends, that is a show. I will see you back here for DruidCast episode 161 next month. But until then, stay safe and well, and I wish you all peace and blessed be. Goodbye.